Good evening, Professor Johnson. My article for review is The Book of Others, Canadian Multiculturalism, the State and Its Political Legacies by Rinaldo Walcott. My outline will, for the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about who Rinaldo Walcott is, Eve Hawke, Professor Eve Hawke, and her work, a summary of the article, and my view on multiculturalism in Canada. Dr. Rinaldo Walcott is an associate professor in the Department of Social Justice Education at the University of Toronto. His research includes cultural studies, cultural theory, and queer and gender theory. He holds a BA from York University and a master's and PhD from the University of Toronto. He was a recent guest lecturer this academic year, where he visited the Cultures of Resistance in the Americas class. He discussed his recently published works, Black Life, and his views on Black life in Canada is what he discussed that as well. He published several other books and articles analyzing his various research topics, but the two that I'm most familiar with are Homo Poetics, Queer Space and Black Queer Diaspora, and the popular book called Black Like Who. Professor Eve Hawke is an associate professor at York University in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics. In addition to her book, Multiculturalism Within a Bilingual Framework, Language, Race, and Belonging in Canada, which examines the government of Canada's attempt to forge a national policy of unity based on multiculturalism within a bilingual framework. She's also published 13 other articles, including Multiculturalism Within a Bilingual Framework, a retrospective, and In the Name of the National Multicultural Family, the documentation of honor killings and the pedagogy of pain, among others. So, what is multiculturalism? According to Britannica.com, multiculturalism is the view that cultures, races, and ethnicities, particularly those of minority groups, deserve special acknowledgement of their differences within a dominant political culture. However, I found a more detailed and what I consider authentic definition of the term in Sarah Song's Multiculturalism article for Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy website, on their philosophy website. The idea of multiculturalism in contemporary political discourse and in political philosophy is about how to understand and respond to the challenges associated with cultural and religious diversity. The term multicultural is often used as a descriptive term to characterize the fact of diversity in a society. To me, this part speaks to how Canada presents itself to the world as one unified, diverse country. It goes on to say, while the term has come to encompass a variety of prospective claims, it is fair to say that proponents of multiculturalism reject the ideal of the melting pot in which members of minority groups are expected to assimilate into the dominant culture in favor of an ideal. The article looks at the creation of multiculturalism as a state policy in Canada and its effect on non-white English and French-speaking individuals within the nation. Walcott uses the research and analysis documented in the book Multiculturalism Within a Bilingual Framework by York professor Eva Hawke to guide us through the concerns of multiculturalism. He begins his article by reminding Canadian readers that Pierre Elliott Trudeau introduced the multiculturalism policy to Parliament in October 1971, not to change the fundamental character of the modern Canadian nation-state. The policy's intent was to manage the non-French and non-English peoples of the nation. By manage, he is referring to the ongoing tensions of Anglophone and Francophone Canadians in 1963, and the Canadian government established the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism to respond to the growing unrest among French Canadians in Quebec, who called for the protection of their language and culture and opportunities to participate fully in political and economic decision-making. The report produced by the B&B Commission, for short, cemented the idea that French and English British ethnicities constituted the founding races of Canada. However, the move to using language rather than ethnicities for white French and English British was a tactic to prevent racial designation as foundational to the nation. Any individual that did not fit into those two categories would not be considered the original founders and would be designated as others. Walcott goes on to quote Robert Stanfield, a progressive conservative opposition leader who endorsed the policy, by stating that the emphasis given to multiculturalism was in no way to constitute an attack on the basic duality of our country. However, the duality that was already assumed, French and English British speaking individuals, were fundamental to the founding of the nation, and the assumed duality was also articulated in our legislation and the laws of the nation. Walcott looks at multiculturalism as raciological thinking. In its simplest meaning, raciology, is defined as the study of human races. Rinaldo continues to reference Hawke's work throughout the article, using it as a basis to understand how the Canadian nation formed and managed its non-French and non-English British others, to provide an account of how language, race, and culture have produced the context of multicultural Canada. Eve Hawke's work focuses on the B&B's Commission's preliminary report and Book 1 and 4 of their final report. Book 1 being titled The Official Languages, and Book 4 of that report is titled The Cultural Contributions of the Other Ethnic Groups. And that information was used to gain a better understanding of the effects of Canadian multicultural policy, politics, and their associated imaginaries. Her study begins by referencing a quote from previous Parti Québécois leader, Jacques Parizeau, in his 1995 October outburst, where he suggested the reason that Quebec lost its votes for the second time in an effort to become an independent country was the fault of ethnic and individuals or people with money. Looking at his actual quote, we are beaten, yes, it is true, but by what? Basically, by money and ethnic votes. Hawke pinpoints how deep structures of language, culture, and race continue to shape contemporary Canadian politics, the public sphere, the national imaginary. It is the shaping of the contemporary Canadian national imaginary that places English/British and French languages outside the boundaries of race and ethnicity, and taking these two accents to form cultures which have become the founding cultures of Canada. Hawke goes on to suggest that the issue with this is that language and culture has come to now stand in for race and raciological thinking, and this is apparent in new practices and ways more than 40 years later. Walcott states that Hawke's analysis of the B&B Commission's preliminary and final reports, as well as Jacques Perreault's outbursts about ethnicity, points to the reasons why the term barbaric cultural practices is currently used in the Canadian Citizenship Guide. Hawke's review of Book 4 is important for us to understand how modes and citizenship that is grounded in language acts as an alibi to identify racial designations. The question of language in Book 4 is meant to mark those who are neither French nor English British as other, as I said before, and can be seen or is interpreted as an attempt to designate whether these others must integrate or not. Walcott states in his article that language is not merely a mode of communication or just speech, it acts as a mode of integration and signals a form of citizenship. Canada's process of using language to form the ideal citizenship revolves around the understanding that the Canadian nation is bicultural and is white in its origin. The fact that other ethnic groups might also label their initial or only language as English and French will pose a problem for the national image of the country. Therefore, new ways of visualizing racialized francophones or anglophones, like immigrants from the Black Caribbean, as belonging outside of the nation, meaning not part of the two founding races, were needed to be identified, as well as to affirm their belonging inside the nation, which supports the creation of multiculturalism. Book 4 also works to produce ways of thinking about citizenship in the nation. These new ways of thinking only understand that non white Canadians appear here through immigration post World War II and denies the existence of non white Canadians prior to Confederation. South Asian, Asian, and Black Canadian citizens are actively denied in the multiculturalism as a state policy prior to World War II. Hawke's analysis of multiculturalism demonstrates how language comes to make whiteness as the legitimate nation and non-whiteness as marking an invasion of otherness. Invasion otherness. Hawke's analysis of the report also outlines the stakes of citizenship that arise from multiculturalism, specifically for those who are not considered founders of the nation. It identifies how white settler states secured its dominance through the group's rights accorded to official language communities and how official language communities and how language was identified as a fundamental element of culture for the founding races, even as it was deemed to be a private and peripheral element of culture for other ethnic groups. Recommendations established in Book 4 from the report was assigned to the citizenship branch of the Department of the Secretary of State, the agency that is now responsible for matters affecting social integration of immigrants and the cultural activities of all ethnic groups. Further issues from the multiculturalism state policy is that French and English British Canadians are produced as without race/ethnicity against immigrants, and that citizenship requires cultivation, which means other ethnic groups require stewardship into Canadian citizenship while it is inherent for the French and English British. What Hawke's work wants us to look at, Walcott states, is how the formation of the state and its practices. Much of the critical knowledge surrounding multiculturalism starts at citizenship, she suggests that we think carefully about how the framework of systems like the B&B Commission work to legitimize the state and secure its power. Even when you take a look at policies post 9/11, much of the security and anti-terrorism laws, there has been an absence of how such policies and practices continue to secure the legitimacy of the nation state as an entity for managing movement, people, and belonging. Instead, much of the debate has focused on containment and exclusion. The article goes on to say that Hawke's book and its analysis of multiculturalism as developed by the B&B Commission is a reminder that we need to think of human life beyond the state, that other state formations are possible, even though modern state formations in the West are deeply racist. Walcott refers to Stuart Hall's theory of conjunctural analysis, which states that once a certain social and cultural settlement occurs, we should create a new productive space for disagreements and social change. Hall also states that contradiction in these policies are the reasons why dominant settlements occur. Contradictions like the one that suggests that Canada is an accomplished multicultural nation where questions of race can be settled through legislative and judicial recourse. Walcott states in his article that through Hawke's work, it's apparent from the beginning of the B&B Commission that they had no intention of allowing those racialized as others to participate or shape what the nation might become. Hawke suggests that a new way forward to potentially resolve national tension around the racialized stranger is to offer a reassessment of the emergence and role of multiculturalism and its multiple racializing practices, instead of using the policy of multiculturalism to simultaneously manage race and make it disappear. I would end by saying that Canada's approach to multiculturalism is not only misleading but dangerous. since the perceived identity of a true Canadian is viewed as white English or French speaking, and even white English or French speaking, and even non-white speaking English or French Canadians' willingness to assimilate into white Canadian culture, maybe by learning the country's official language or in some other way, immigrant Canadians are met with numerous economic, social, cultural, and political barriers that do not allow meaningful equality to exist for these others. Thank you.